Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're diving into the psychology of an entire generation. Generation X, if you were born between 1965 and 1980, this is your generation. And if you weren't, understanding Gen X psychology gives you insight into how roughly 65 million people think, feel, and navigate the world. I'm a psychologist, and I've spent years studying generational psychology. Generation X is fascinating because they're often called the forgotten generation, the latchkey kids, the generation raised without applause. But that upbringing created a distinctive psychology that's shaped who they are as adults. So today, I'm breaking down 7 key things about the psychology of Generation X. Let's start with the first one, pragmatic cynicism. Generation X grew up during a time of significant cultural disillusionment. They watched Watergate unfold on television. They grew up during the Cold War with the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. They saw their parents' marriages fall apart at record rates. Divorce was becoming normalized. They witnessed corporate layoffs and economic recessions. All of this happened during their formative years, and it created a deeply pragmatic, cynical worldview. Unlike baby boomers who believed they could change the world, and unlike millennials who were told they were special, Gen X learned early that the world is complicated and that institutions aren't inherently trustworthy. This isn't pessimism exactly, it's pragmatic realism. Gen X doesn't expect things to work out perfectly. They expect obstacles. They plan for worst-case scenarios. This actually makes them quite resilient because they're rarely disappointed. They're prepared for adversity. But here's the psychological cost. Gen X tends toward cynicism even in situations where optimism might serve them better. They can struggle with believing that good things are possible. They often expect the worst, and sometimes they unconsciously sabotage positive outcomes because they don't trust them. Understanding this about yourself if you're Gen X can be liberating. You can consciously choose to be pragmatic without being cynical. The second key thing about Gen X psychology is fierce independence. Gen X is the generation of latchkey kids. While their parents were working, Gen X kids came home to empty houses. They learned to fend for themselves at young ages. They made their own meals, did their own homework, solved their own problems. Their parents were often preoccupied with their own challenges, divorces, career changes, financial stress. So Gen X learned not to depend on adults for emotional support. This created a generation that's extremely self-reliant. Gen X doesn't wait for permission. They don't need external validation. They figure things out on their own. This independence is a strength. Gen X are problem solvers and self-starters. They don't need hand-holding. But the psychological cost is that Gen X can struggle with asking for help. They can be isolated because they're used to handling everything alone. They can have difficulty trusting others because they learned early that they ultimately have to depend on themselves. If you're Gen X, this might show up in your adult relationships as difficulty being vulnerable or asking your partner for support. It might show up in your career as difficulty delegating because you think if you want something done right, you have to do it yourself. Recognizing this pattern can help you consciously build interdependence rather than pure independence. The third thing is emotional resilience born from necessity. Growing up without constant parental oversight and emotional guidance, Gen X kids had to develop emotional resilience early. They learned to process their emotions alone. They learned to be tough. They learned that complaining doesn't change anything, so you might as well deal with it and move on. This created a generation that's remarkably resilient in the face of adversity. Gen X has lower rates of reported anxiety and depression compared to younger generations, not because they don't experience these things, but because they're psychologically tougher. They're more willing to push through discomfort. They don't expect life to be easy, so when it's hard, they don't fall apart. They just adapt. But here's the psychological shadow side. Gen X can be emotionally repressed. They don't always process their feelings fully. They stuff emotions down and keep moving. Later in life, this can manifest as unresolved trauma, physical health problems related to stress, or difficulty in relationships because they're not good at expressing emotions. If you're Gen X, giving yourself permission to feel your feelings and express them can be really healing. The fourth characteristic is skepticism of authority. Gen X grew up questioning authority in ways previous generations didn't. They saw their government lie during Watergate. They saw religious institutions fail them. They saw that authority figures weren't always right. They developed a healthy skepticism of institutions and powerful people. This manifests as critical thinking. Gen X doesn't automatically believe what they're told. They question narratives. They think for themselves. This is a real strength in a world full of misinformation. But the psychological challenge is that Gen X can be distrustful to a fault. They can struggle to trust leaders, experts, or institutions even when those institutions might actually be trustworthy. They can miss out on benefits of cooperation and community because they're too skeptical. The fifth characteristic is what I call existential adaptability. Gen X lived through unprecedented technological change. They grew up with vinyl records, then cassettes, then CDs, then digital music, then streaming. They grew up without computers, then watched the internet transform everything. They had to adapt constantly. This created a generation that's comfortable with change and uncertainty in ways previous generations weren't. Gen X is actually quite adaptable. They're not threatened by new technology or new situations because they've been adapting their whole lives. But the psychological cost is a certain kind of groundlessness. When everything is constantly changing, it's hard to develop a solid sense of stability or tradition. Gen X can feel like they're always in transition. They can struggle with commitment because they know that change is inevitable. They can have difficulty establishing roots. The sixth thing is what I call the psychology of invisibility. Generation X was sandwiched between two much larger generations, the baby boomers and the millennials. As a result, they've received far less cultural attention. They don't have a strong generational identity like boomers or millennials. This invisibility actually shaped their psychology profoundly. Gen X learned not to need attention or recognition. They don't crave the spotlight. They're not looking for external validation. In some ways, this is healthy. They don't depend on others' approval. But it also means Gen X often doesn't advocate for themselves. They don't toot their own horns. They can feel invisible even in their own families and workplaces. They can struggle with imposter syndrome because they're used to not being seen. If you're Gen X, you might need to consciously practice self-promotion and letting people know about your accomplishments. The seventh and final characteristic is emotional self-sufficiency paired with loneliness. Because Gen X learned to be independent and self-sufficient emotionally, they often don't reach out for connection. They manage their emotions alone. They solve their problems alone. But humans are social creatures, and this self-sufficiency can mask a deeper loneliness. Studies show that Gen X has high rates of loneliness, particularly among men, even though they're emotionally functional. They can go through life without developing deep friendships because they learn not to depend on others for emotional support. They can have marriages where there's limited emotional intimacy because they're not comfortable being vulnerable. They can feel isolated even when surrounded by people. Now, here's what's really important to understand about all of these characteristics. They're not inherently good or bad. They're adaptations to a specific historical moment. Generation X developed these psychological traits because they were necessary for survival and functioning in the world they grew up in. These traits helped them thrive in an unstable, rapidly changing world. But as an adult, you have the ability to choose which of these traits serve you and which ones might be limiting you. If you're Gen X and you're reading about these characteristics, you might recognize yourself. You might see how your upbringing shaped your psychology. That awareness is the first step toward change. If you're excessively cynical, you can consciously practice seeing possibilities. If you struggle with asking for help, you can consciously practice vulnerability with safe people. If you're emotionally repressed, you can learn to express your feelings. If you're distrustful of authority, You can learn to evaluate each situation individually rather than applying blanket skepticism. If you struggle with commitment, you can consciously practice staying even when change feels inevitable. The beauty of understanding your generational psychology is that you realize you have choices. You're not destined to repeat patterns. You can learn. You can grow. You can integrate the strengths of your generation, your resilience, your independence, your critical thinking, your adaptability, while working on the shadow sides, your cynicism, your difficulty with vulnerability, your tendency toward isolation. If you're not Gen X but you know people who are, understanding their psychology can help you have more compassion for them. They might seem cold or distant, but that's because they learned to be self-sufficient. They might seem cynical, but that's because they learned that the world is complicated. They might not express their emotions openly, but that doesn't mean they're not feeling deeply. Generation X is a generation that was raised without much applause, without constant praise, without the feeling that the world was conspiring in their favor. In some ways, this was hard. In other ways, it created a remarkably strong, capable, adaptable generation. They're the generation that gets things done. They're the generation that doesn't wait for perfect circumstances. They just figure it out and move forward. Understanding the psychology of Generation X, whether you're part of it or not, gives us insight into how our early experiences shape who we become. It shows us that our psychology is not fixed. It's a result of our history, our circumstances, our experiences. And if we're aware of these patterns, we have the power to change them. Thank you for watching. If you're Gen X, I'd love to hear in the comments which of these 7 characteristics resonated most with you. Do you see yourself in this description? And if you're not Gen X, do you understand the Gen X people in your life a little better now? Let me know, and I'll see you in the next video.